I'm very pleased to welcome our third speaker, Hatzimoysis. Anthony is Associate Professor at the National Capodistrian University of Athens. I'm sure you're all familiar with his work, so I will just say that he specializes in fields of both continental and analytic philosophy, and that he is particularly interested in the philosophy of emotions and the theory of values. Anthony is the author of many books. I will mention only the ones written in English: Philosophy and the Emotions, Self-Knowledge, The Philosophy of Sartre, published by Cambridge, Oxford, and Rutgers. Today he will speak to us about anxiety and the self. Anthony.
Thank you very much. I'm grateful to the Gavagai collective for the invitation, and my thanks also to Don Zahavi for taking time off his really busy academic schedule and joining us for this symposium, so thanks. I will talk about affective consciousness, and I will close with a couple of remarks about the self. When I decided to give a presentation about anxiety, I had no idea what the content of the talk might be. I had a general conception of the sort of theories I would look at, but no specific sense of how my argument was to develop or what its conclusion ought to be. I thus grew quite worried and eventually became full of anxiety. When one falls into an affective state, we usually think of it as a mood. And among the main characteristics of moods is their stability. Moods, as enduring occurrences of feeling, appear resistant to change. They thus go against the basic tenet of emotive experience, its episodic character, its falling closely upon, rising after, attending to, or subsiding with alterations in one's environment. The apparent stability of moods might not be confused for absence of psychological activity. In a depressive mood, there might be disquiet. In an elated mood, excitation. However, being in a mood is a phenomenon often taken to present a challenge to the understanding of affective states as attuned to what unfolds in the outside world. The traditional way of articulating that challenge is in terms of intentionality, conceived as directedness at or reference to some object. It has been claimed, for instance, that moods mark a separate domain of the mental, precisely due to their lack of intentional connection to the world. The lack of episodic nature and the lack of intentionality are nevertheless amply compensated, according to some theorists, by the priority that moods enjoy relative to other mental states. That priority applies to cognitive processes, unless, for instance, we approach an object with the right mood, that object will not reveal itself to us as it really is. A sad mood can affect our way of thinking by slowing down our reasoning process, making us pay more attention to detail. Elation appears to have the opposite result, allowing an abundance of information to flow through our senses, painting a multicolored picture of our social environment with a broad brush. Moods, therefore, are affects which themselves affect how we reason. Most significantly, though, the priority of moods determines the onset of corresponding emotions, as when an irritable mood assesses several things as implicitly offensive, thus triggering an angry response. That line of reasoning is culminated in the claim that among the mood phenomena, some figure more prominently than others, forming the background of our interaction with the world. There is a set of fundamental moods, attendance to which reveals important truths about our existence, and perhaps none of the moods is as revealing about the human predicament as the mood of anxiety. I shall offer now some remarks on the plausibility of the above claims. Although my focus will be on anxiety, I intend those remarks to apply to most of the related mood phenomena. However, Anxiety itself raises issues which present a challenge to the standard categorization of affective states. That is mainly because we still lack a proper understanding of how anxiety as a mood relates to the emotion of fear. The standard way of drawing that distinction is in terms of their temporal order, their epistemic status, and their focal clarity. By differences in their temporal index, I mean that, according to some accounts, fear is present-oriented, while anxiety is future-oriented. That sounds intuitively correct, but it cannot be literally the case for the simple reason that fear is a response to what is conceived of as a forthcoming harm. If the harm were present, the corresponding state would not be fear, but pain. Perhaps physical or psychological, but in any case, pain, and not fear that such pain is in the offing. And the same applies to the fear of losing something we hold dear or valuable. The epistemic difference between the two phenomena amounts to fears being generally certain, while anxiety is being generally uncertain. The notion of certainty involved is not transparent to me. However, I acknowledge that many cases of fear, say out in the street, in the face of an attacking dog, or in your bedroom, in the face of a night burglar, come with an overwhelming evidence of your emotional state. There are cases, though, of fear that do not come epistemically packaged. Your foreboding about tomorrow's business meeting, for instance, or your fear of the dark, have a built-in uncertainty about them, since you might not be quite sure what exactly you are going through. Cases of anxiety, on the other hand, might come with an acute experience of restlessness or disquietude that leaves you with no doubt as to what you're currently feeling. Perhaps, when theorists talk about the certainty or uncertainty of those states, they refer not to a subject's awareness of what goes on in his mind, but to the external target of one's affective state. That brings us to the notion of intentionality, which seems to help us demarcate between emotions and moods. There are, though, two different ways of invoking intentionality as a demarcation rule. Traditionally, the idea was that moods differ from emotions due to their lack of an intentional dimension. Recently, the distinction is drawn not in terms of the presence or absence of intentionality, but on the particular type of intentional relation that moods, as opposed to emotions, bear to the world. So, in this part of my presentation, I'm going to dwell on that point with a view to assess the prospects of contemporary attempts to make sense of moods as intentional states. During affective experience, even when everything appears meaningless, the affect itself is not a meaningless occurrence. Every mood, be it positive, negative, or neutral, appears to have some significance. I would suggest that the significance of mood is double-arrowed. A mood indicates something for the life of the person undergoing the experience, while it points at a value-laden aspect of the surrounding world. That pointing at is a kind of intentionality, and its invocation has explanatory value because it helps to render the whole experience intelligible. Citing the general peril that a person encounters helps us to make sense of his mood of anxiety. Invoking the offensiveness of the world he inhabits renders intelligible his irritable mood. By correlating the experience with the salient aspects of a situation, the intentionality of moods appears to enable our understanding why the person is in the mood that he is, by showing why it is reasonable for the subject in his circumstances to be so affected. The standard way to present the intentionality of a mental state is by citing the object at which it is directed. The first candidate for an intentional object that is attributed to moods is the whole world. That proposal appears to do justice to the overwhelming character of many moods. The fact that moods pervade our experience, that they suffuse all aspects of our encounter with reality. Anxiety has been presented as a prominent example of a mood in which I experience a global suspension of the values that sustain my interaction with other human beings. A suspension resulting from a disengagement with the identity I have constructed, and which appears now unable to help me navigate the normative domain. That is a neo-Kantian, I would call it, version of how anxiety is implicated in one's relation to the whole world. There is also the existentialist version of the same point that is prevalent in the contemporary analysis of the phenomenon. In anxiety, the world in which I exist has sunk into insignificance, and the world which is thus disclosed is one in which entities can be freed only in the character of having no involvement. The strange syntax is, of course, due to Heidegger. Those are valuable insights into the phenomenology of moods. However, taken literally, the suggestion that the world is the intentional object of our moods is, in my view, problematic for several reasons, one of which applies to anxiety specifically, while some of which concern moods in general. The claim that a certain mood amounts to the experience of the world as devoid of significance sounds to me more like a description of depression rather than of anxiety. The sense of disengagement with reality, the failure to discover something worth pursuing, not because something else makes a higher demand on your attention, but because nothing of your projects commands anymore your attention, is more a characteristic of depression than it is of anxiety. We need at this point to draw some distinction that will help us understand the relevant phenomena. We may distinguish between an associated feature, such as a symptom, which is a typical aspect of the clinical picture of a more pervasive mood, and a coexisting complication that is an additional mood, or in some cases an additional mood disorder that is also present. In clinical practice, the simultaneous presence of mood disorders goes by the name of comorbidity. Anxiety and depression present high comorbidity that is partly explained by their common negative effects, such as seemingly uncaused tension, chronic worry, and irritability. However, there are also elements of each of those moods which are not shared by the other. Depression is characterized by anhedonia, the total absence of genuine pleasure, whereas an anxious subject can display energy and enthusiasm even when in a fit of anxiety. It is important, therefore, that when it is claimed that anxiety is an intentional state directed at the whole world, that our conception of the world is articulated in a way that captures what is distinctive of that particular mood. There are, however, some general reasons to be skeptical about the proposal to treat not just anxiety, but any mood as intentionally directed to the whole world. First, the proposal employs a notion that is not easy to determine. It is not clear whether we are invited to think of the world as a maximally inclusive situation encompassing all others, or perhaps as an object which has in it everything except for itself, or as the totality of phenomena linked by a complex network of reference to each other. It can be retorted that the proposal requires nothing more than a loose understanding of the term as employed in ordinary contexts. However, that retort does not really answer our query. It rather shows that the appeal of the proposal trades on the ambiguity of the basic terms it employs. Secondly, the proposal makes extensive demands on the representational capacities of ordinary subjects. An affective state that is intentionally correlated to the whole world would entail an ability to form representations that moves well beyond the perspectival, partial, and limited access to one's immediate environment. Thirdly, even if we manage to sort out the above issues, the suggestion that moods are intentionally directed at the world founders on the problem of distinguishability between kinds of affective states. To be outraged with the whole world is not a mood. It is an intense in its phenomenal quality and global in its intentional content emotion. The second proposal about the intentionality of moods treats the generality of the intentional object in a distributive manner. Instead of setting one object, the whole world, as the intentional correlate of mood, it takes as object the members of a disjunctively defined self, composed of anything that comes our way. For any object encountered, we have, during a mood experience, a corresponding intentional relation. That proposal has the advantage of offering a way of distinguishing between emotions which are directed at a single object, be it a particular thing, person, event, or association, and moods which take an indeterminate plurality of objects. However, the proposal appears to me to fail on the issue of intelligibility. A major task for an account of intentionality is to help us make sense of the character of the relevant experience. By correlating the experience with its intentional target, the account should contribute to our understanding why the person is in the mood that he is. However, treating every different object in one's environment as the intentional object of mood may render inexplicable why one is in the particular mood that he is. Let me explain. A mood is typically a state of long duration. It may last for hours, days, even more. During that period, there is a large number of objects which come one's way and which differ not only in their shape and size, but also in their evaluative shape. In a state of anxiety, for instance, a person might happen to listen to a soothing, subtly optimistic tune. While it would be incorrect to think that just by listening to the tune that person will snap out of his anxiety, it would also be wrong to claim that the person is unable to notice the life-affirming air of that tune. However, decreeing that the soothing tune is the intentional object of anxiety does not render the mood intelligible. That point, I think, generalizes to other moods. Take the case of sadness. Perhaps the combination of a gloomy mood and the jolliness of the tune creates in the listener a feeling of sympathy for the vain efforts of his fellow humans, or an irritation with his uncultured neighbors for their choice of music. The arising of those emotions might be explicable by the concurrence of the negative mood and the perception of the jolly tune. What is not plausible, though, is the explication of the particular mood by means of the representation of the jolly tune. Given the wide variety in the evaluative profile of the objects in one's environment, the postulated intentional connection between mood and any object that happens to come one's way fails to discharge the task of rationalizing explanation. The third and most recent attempt to articulate an account of the intentionality of moods is presented not by reference to some object, either singular or plural, but in terms of their representational content. We are invited to think that what is represented during a mood is a property as such. In an anxious mood, it is aversiveness. In an irritable mood, it is offensiveness. In a mood of contentment, it is delightfulness, etc. The property represented by a mood is not attached to anything in particular. It is unbound. The proposal admits that moods appear to lack intentional object. but it claims that this lack does not deprive them of intentionality, since moods are states with a content which represents an unbound affective property. That approach initially appears promising, since it sets a criterion for distinguishing emotion from mood, while acknowledging that each mood has a different character precisely because it involves a different mental content due to the unbound property that it represents. However, in my opinion, the proposal is problematic on conceptual grounds. More precisely, it is an account of intentionality that involves several conceptual confusions. The first confusion concerns the notion of ordinary object and intentional object. I may love my cat, a living entity, admire an espresso machine, an artifact, hate the change in the weather, an event, wish for world peace, a state of affairs, reflect about rectangularity, a property, and so on. Simply put, an intentional object is whatever a mental state is directed at, but that at which the state is directed is not necessarily an object, if by that term one means a medium-sized, three-dimensional thing. The present intentionalist proposal states that moods lack intentional objects because they are about properties and not about objects, but that is obviously a problematic statement. The second confusion is of a different order, as it concerns a fundamental metaphysical issue. The intentionalist claims that moods are intentional because they represent unbound properties. But what exactly is an unbound property? At a minimum, we require disambiguation of the meanings that may be involved in that notion. Here I shall consider only three interpretations. First interpretation. Unbound is a property that is not bound to one particular substance. That is a claim easy to understand because it is totally trivial. No property is ever bound to one particular substance. Each property is in principle instantiable at more than one place at once, and that is why we tell our students that we call all particulars and properties universals. A second interpretation could be, unbound is a property that is not instantiated. If that is the meaning of the notion of unbound property, then it is hard to comprehend how someone can be in a particular affective state that represents a non-instantiated property. Notice that the intentionalist does not claim that someone is in a particular state because that state represents that a certain property is not instantiated. That would be the representation of a fact, or of a state of affairs, or of a proposition. And our intentionalist denies that this is the meaning it intends. A third interpretation might venture to focus not on what type of property an unbound property is, but on how we might think of it. Unbound is a property thought of not as instantiated by an object, but thought of merely as a property. Again, that claim offers little help in making sense of what is distinctive about the representational content of mood, or indeed of any affective state. Considering a property merely as a property appears to me to be a task for logical or metaphysical analysis. It is simply not clear why the representation of the properties of squareness, or of scariness, of triangularity, or of threadingness, represented not as being or as soon to be instantiated, neither as owned or soon to be owned by some object, merely as properties should have any affective significance at all. The preceding discussion indicates the limitations of the intentionalist approach to moods. The problems of intentionalism do not imply that we should treat moods as a purely internal affair. Anxiety, just like any other affective phenomenon, is not detached from the world. I have been talking about anxiety as if it were a single state. However, there are several phenomena that come under the heading of anxiety, most often defined in their acute form as types of psychological malfunction. We thus have panic disorder, with or without agoraphobia. Anxiety is triggered over specific items, such as heights, injections, elevators. We have obsessive-compulsive disorders, crucially characterized by the recurrence of intrusive thoughts and repetitive forms of conduct. And a whole cluster of post-traumatic stress disorders, with a distressful yet persistent re-experiencing of aversive events, followed by the agitated response to seemingly unrelated events. Note that those categories present anxiety through its disorders. In fact, it has become increasingly difficult, especially in the psychological literature, to think of anxiety as anything but a disorder. The emphasis on the pathological nature of anxiety is one of the factors that matters to therapeutic interventions. The other factor is the delimitation of each anxious experience around a specific stimuli. By focusing, for instance, on your avoidance of elevators, or on your recurrent cancellations of your dental appointments, the therapists might manage, usually through pharmaceutical or behavioral means, to assuage the particular problem. However, that approach gives rise to some methodological worries. On the one hand, it is not evident that what is treated is anxiety as such, rather than some of its arguably most unpleasant symptoms. On the other hand, it is not clear that the therapists approach the relevant cases as indicative of anxiety rather than as ordinary cases of fear. Fear of lack of mobility in the case of elevators, or fear of pain in the case of dental treatment. Let us grant then that when successful, the relevant therapy cures a particular fear. That does not ipso facto mean that it illuminates the nature of anxiety. To think that it does is to assume continuity between fear and anxiety in terms of some quantifiable variable, be it duration or intensity. However, that assumption is questionable. Consider, for instance, the anxiety experienced during vertigo. What is distinctive of that experience, affectively, is that, strictly speaking, one is not afraid of falling over the balcony, but of throwing oneself over. Consider also the paradox of anxiety generated over a past event. In facing the gaming tables today, the gambler who had resolved last week not to touch the cards again experiences anxiety not because he is afraid of what might happen as the night unfolds, nor because he has forgotten the fact of his past decision, but because he fully acknowledges his decision as a fact of the past, appealing to which cannot magically and on its own make him stay away from the game. The gambler somehow begs his past decision to come and save him, and anxiety is the growing realization that no past fact as such, not even his own past psychological fact, can resolve his present problem for him. Examples like that of the gambler who wants to stay true to his decision, or of the father about to sacrifice what is most valuable in order to reaffirm his faith, have been employed by philosophers who intend to highlight the revelatory potency of certain rather rare and extraordinary events in one's life. However, anxiety, in my view, is significant because of its ordinariness. And as I approach my conclusion, I'll focus just on this. Consider what, in my view, is the most interesting, as well as the least addressed category in today's clinical taxonomy. the generalized anxiety disorder, what used to be called free-floating anxiety. The term refers to chronic, excessive, and uncontrollable worry about a number of apparently disconnected events or activities, such as one's academic performance or the balance of one's bank account. Symptoms of that disorder include restlessness or feeling on edge, being easily fatigued, muscle tension, unsatisfying sleep. Does any of this sound familiar? No. Those phenomena have traditionally been understood as the surface indicators of underlying battles one gives with oneself so as to face up or to postpone facing up to the demands of faith or of the inevitability of one's death or of the responsibility brought about by one's freedom. Assessing the soundness of those proposals is far beyond the scope of this talk, so let me simply close with the following remarks. Anxiety has intentional content if by that term we purport to capture not just the reference of the state to the world, but also to the subject's stance towards himself and his engagement with the world. In that sense, anxiety differs from fear in being both outward and inward directed. It involves an inescapable reference to how I, myself, am about to respond to an outer event. Anxiety appears counterproductive. In many cases, undergoing anxiety is not simply unpleasant, it is also a source of difficulties in realizing a fixed goal. But that is, I think, its major strategic value. Anxiety is often a form of affective procrastination, whose function is to disrupt the normal unfolding of the events, thus serving the wish, often irrational, that the foreseeable event be avoided, either because it will not be realized or because it will, but with oneself being discharged from the task of bringing it about, letting the events, as we say, take their own course, while oneself being somehow magically removed from the scene. That point can be expressed with reference to the normative character of personal identity. Each one of us is what one is projecting oneself to be, professionally, socially, sentimentally, in light of one's commitments towards both the world at large and particular others. It is as if I constantly make an appointment with a certain conception of myself at the other end of the afternoon, the week, or the year. Anxiety, if you wish, is the unspoken, unarticulated worry that I might miss the appointment, not because I was held up, but because I am no longer sure that I really want to meet myself there. Okay, cheers.
Thank you very much, Anthony. That was fascinating.
Can I go now?
No, you will answer some questions, hopefully. Yes, please.
Wow. Can anxiety be thought of being intentional towards its own anxious state and referring to itself, and thus making the state of anxiety even worse, which can be clearly seen in cases of panic attacks, where it functions as a sort of feedback loop that not only refers to something particular, an event or something that happens in the world, not only to this and the constant state of judgment towards oneself and one's actions and how he's going to respond to what is happening, but also to the state itself of anxiety.
Good. Okay. Yes, very, very, very good remark. I suppose that anxiety, being a self-referential affective state, may easily transform itself into an explicitly reflective state, and in that case, it would feed on itself. It is not an issue thoroughly explored in the literature. It would be interesting to do so. Usually when we have cases of affects really perpetrating themselves in reflective circles, the standard example would be shame. Shame is usually followed by blushing, and realizing that you are blushing increases your shame potentially, because you cannot control that you're blushing, and this makes you feel even more embarrassed, and so on. It will be interesting to see how anxiety perpetuates its procrastinating pattern through that reflective activity. So, yeah, good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Picking up on the last one, there's a kind of anxiety, I'm a neurologist, there's a kind of anxiety which is called a psychotic anxiety. This is very different from the kind of anxiety that you described, or maybe not so different, but the fundamental thing about this psychotic anxiety seems to be this feedback loop. So I tend to let's say, describe it more like a hermeneutic bias of, and not just a mood. And I think this is very interesting because there are no actual intentional properties in such an anxiety state. This state feeds on itself and it's so deep that we can't really ascribe it to any, let's say, volitional acts that therapists would be inclined to treat. That's it.
Okay, that is truly interesting. I need to explore this further. My initial exploration would try to focus, first of all, on whether the patient in that case thinks that the future is epistemically open. Secondly, whether there is an intentional target, whether there is some specific task in relation to which the patient has severe bouts of anxiety. And then I will try to see whether this can be self-regulated or not. Apparently, if it is psychotic, the difficulties are immense. So there are layers of analysis here that we might employ. But, okay, thanks for the suggestion.
Thank you.
Mr. Zahavi has a question.
So very quickly, there's a lot of people currently working on affective atmospheres.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what you would say just a little bit about the difference between them and moods.
Oh, goes right. Okay. Yes, there are many German-speaking guys who are obsessed with that. I would focus on concepts like the menacing or the uncanny, because these have in them an underpinning of stimogen, which goes both to the mood side and the atmosphere side. I'm a bit reluctant to use atmosphere at this stage of my exploration as anything more than shared mood. I think that if we want to transcend the notion of shared affectivity, shared emotion, then shared mood, we will be getting into various metaphysical and conceptual troubles. But some people have no difficulty doing that. I do not think it's methodologically helpful. So that's my issue. But if you know the literature, you will understand what the problem is. Yeah, good.
Any other questions? Please keep it short.
If I understood you well, I feel that the opposite of fear is purely external, comes from outside, the opposite. Though, in the case of anxiety, it is my participation. And there's a positive aspect of anxiety, in the sense that when I engage in something which is meaningless, or I take it to be meaningless, then I feel anxiety and emotional moods which will bring me back to the normal state.
Okay.
This is what you meant before when you said that well, it's a kind of defense mechanism, an extension type, to put it like that. And also, anxiety is there's another aspect. When I have made choices or I experience a kind of extreme freedom, then I feel anxiety because I don't know what to. I feel responsible for whatever I do.
Yes. Well, very quickly, I agree with your remarks. Just to bring into the discussion the fact that there are also some closely related mood phenomena which I did not address here, like ennui or boredom, which also present a challenge to the meaningfulness of our immediate environment. The basic difference between fear and anxiety in that context is that although none of them is unrelated to oneself, in anxiety, myself is part of the picture. In fear, I am the background to the danger I do perceive in the outside world. I mean, fear is a response to value. It is because I hold something valuable that something can be a threat for me. But the attentional focus is out there. In anxiety, things are much more complicated. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. That was the last question, I'm afraid, because we have completely run out of time. So we will take a very short break for about 10 minutes, and we will start at 7:30 when professors have the stall to give us. Thank you very much again.